Welcome to the Herbal Hour, Dr. Josh Korn. Today we're talking about naturopathic medicine, mental health, and whatever else comes into the conversation. So, Dr. Korn, can you introduce yourself and what you do to the audience, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me back. I really enjoyed our conversation last time. Happy to be back with you. I'm Josh Korn. I am a licensed naturopathic doctor. I practice both in Portland, Oregon, and I also am starting a holistic health education naturopathic practice in Texas. I just moved to Austin about 3 months ago. So kind of trying to blend the world of, all the cool things that I can do in Oregon with my very extensive scope of practice, and then all of the super foundational, also really cool naturopathic modalities that I can do in a pre-licensed state like Texas.
So you're doing telehealth from
Mm-hmm.
Texas to Portland, and then you're kind of opening a telehealth or in-person type thing in Texas?
Yeah, I'll focus on telehealth right now. I was, seeing patients in person in Portland, but with the pandemic and everything, people mostly were choosing to do telehealth even when I was still in Portland. So it's worked really well for me to be able to see my patients in Portland. And the plan with the clinic that I'm working with is that, I have residents there who are able to see the patients in person and do physical exams on them if that needs to be done, lab work, all that kind of stuff. So I have, they have care, they have a clinic they can go to. And then I'll come back a few times a year to see patients in person and, be able to have that one-to-one connection building time with them.
Yeah, we were briefly talking about the difference between telehealth and in-person visits. What would you say is the biggest downside and the biggest upside of telehealth? Because it seems like medicine in general is moving towards a very telehealth model.
Yeah, I think we are going to see it just continue. Like this was always the plan for medicine. It was just really expedited when COVID hit. So I don't think it's going anywhere. People appreciate the convenience, and I like the convenience too. It's I think easier to have a doctor's appointment when you can just take 30 minutes out of your day to do it, rather than having to take time to come to the office, have the visit. That's harder for people to schedule. So I think the convenience aspect is definitely the biggest pro for patients. The downside to it I see is, especially with new patients, it can be a little bit harder to make that connection with the provider because you're not in person. We're interacting over the internet, and while we are learning as a society how to do that, and we're getting better and better at it, there's a little bit missing to that. So I'm looking forward to coming back to Portland beginning of next year and seeing all my patients and actually getting that time with them.
Yeah, there's something very different about sitting in front of someone, like some kind of almost energetic difference. And there's a ritual healing part of medicine that isn't often talked about, that just the act of like going to the doctor's office, sitting down, getting your blood pressure taken, these things have a healing benefit in and of themselves because they're part of this kind of ritual of healing. When you go to the doctor, he's gonna or she's gonna tell you what to take, and you're gonna feel better, and you're gonna ride home with a smile on your face. And like that is all just taken away with telehealth, unless one purposefully and consciously tries to build that kind of ritual aspect into medicine. Like I remember as a student, a lot of the times when I would take somebody's pulse, like the Chinese medicine type pulse, it just taking their pulse was therapeutic in and of itself. I always noticed that they kind of relaxed, they calmed down a little bit, just the contact, just the feeling, oh, this person's caring for me, that is healing. And you can't get that over online. You can't get physical contact. You can't hear someone's voice, nuances of body language and tone, and so you lose a lot. But it is really convenient, and it's what we got, right? So
It
what can
is.
you do
It's what
about
we
it?
got. And honestly, if it makes it easier for people to schedule and see me more frequently, I think that's a good thing. A lot of times people, especially with chronic illness, they have something like blood pressure, diabetes, or mental health, depression, anxiety, that they benefit every time they see you. Every time there's a touch, it's like, oh, I get a little bit better every single time. But work and life and everything, it can it can make that challenging to schedule. So in that sense, if the convenience is helpful for people, I'm all for it. But I totally agree with you that in-person time is really healing. And I think that as medicine moves further and further away from a touch-oriented system, you know, like physical exams are not done as frequently as they used to be done in the past because we have better diagnostic tools. I don't know that I would say that. We have more sensitive laboratory and imaging modalities that can help us with diagnostic decisions. Doesn't mean that physical exam is worthless, but I think that's often skipped in medical visits. So that touch isn't even there anymore. And now we're not even having that in-person aspect. I think that having a blend of the two is the ideal goal, right? Like being able to see your doctor in person or on telehealth, whichever works best for you. And I think that's really where we're going to see things go.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think having a combination of both seems to make a lot of sense. Depending on what kind of visits needed, like if you need to see them in person, you need to see, you know, something on their skin or something of that nature, or do a physical exam. In person is obviously better, but if it's just checking up on them, making sure, as naturopaths, we like to help people with their lifestyle, their diet, things like that, that require kind of constant coaching and encouragement and checking in, you know, week by week. That makes sense, telehealth or even a phone call.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's definitely benefits too. And the system I have with my residents is nice because I'm able to talk to them. We're always in communication about patients. So, you know, I had a patient today who I saw last week. He really needed a physical exam and some tests done. So talked to my resident about it, sent him to her. She handled all that for me. So it's a good like cooperative model as well, because I think a lot of times the more people are on board and knowing what's going on with you, the better care you get. Having a team of people care for you is better in a lot of ways than just having one single person care for you, because you get different perspectives and different, you know, you get to benefit from everyone's knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And with this movement towards telehealth, I think this is the perfect time for mental health to really be considered at a higher level in general in this country. Because out of all things, I think telehealth is very good for mental health because it is typically so based on conversation, at least psychotherapy is, for example, or like a psychiatrist based on prescriptions, where you don't have to physically necessarily see them.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that a lot of times for people who have really severe depression or anxiety or PTSD, that sense of like going to the doctor and that ritual of it for many people can be very powerful and calming. But for people who have, you know, certain mental health concerns, that can actually be a really stressful, triggering, anxiety producing experience for them. And so being able to do it from home actually is a lot better for them, because they're in their safe space, they're in their environment where they feel comfortable with sharing, and it kind of takes that it takes that boundary down a little bit.
In these past few months, have you noticed more patients coming in with anxiety and depressive type symptoms?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, those were always a big part of my practice, because you know, naturopathic doctors focus on the whole person, but I always talk about mental health and emotional health and social health with my patients, because I think it's a huge part of physical pathology as well. So that was always a big part of my practice, but I think that now more than ever, I'm seeing people who had anxiety and depression issues. Oftentimes it's a lot worse now, and people who didn't have it, it's like new anxiety and new depression, because we've had 7 months of complete uncertainty. You know, there's still no real certainty with the future, and that for human beings is very, very challenging when our brain isn't able to like discern a pattern and identify it and figure out what comes next based on that pattern. We get real freaked out.
Yeah, that's one of the things that wasn't considered when all the plans were made during COVID, is how is it going to affect people's well-being and their mental health? And obviously it hasn't been good.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's such a fine line. It's a real tightrope to walk of how do we balance physical health with mental health and social health. And I don't know that there's a right answer. I think it's different for every individual person, but it's definitely been challenging for everybody. I see a lot of, even if people, it's not like I have anxiety, I have depression. I see a lot of people with, I just feel really stressed out. I just feel really tired, or I'm having a lot of trouble sleeping and I never really had issues sleeping before a few months ago. That is how anxiety and depression presents in a lot of people, right? It's not always that typical symptom picture that we're taught in school. It's these little nuanced symptoms that people didn't have before: trouble with sleep, feeling stressed, feeling tired, feeling irritable. So I see a lot of that as well.
What is your approach, or what has been your approach with people that come in with these type of symptoms? Like, what do you like to do with them?
Yeah. Depends on the person, right? It's individualized, but I think in general, supporting them in feeling the uncertainty and being okay with it. And I think that, that's something I am still working on myself. I think we're all working on that. Like, how do we exist in a world where things are so up in the air? I think journaling has been really helpful for a lot of my patients, because it allows them to get those thoughts out of their head, through their body, onto paper. You can do whatever you want with the pages when you're done. You can throw them away, you can keep them, but it just is like channeling that energy a little bit. Also, exercise. And I know that for, people who have anxiety and depression have heard a million times, oh, you should exercise and you'll feel better. And taking that first step is often really, really challenging. And I think that people who haven't ever suffered from those conditions don't get how challenging that is. But honestly, even just walking, something to discharge all that mental energy and bring you down into your body, I think is a huge, huge piece of it. And we were talking about that a little bit, before we started recording. Like, you were mentioning your neighborhood in New York where you grew up. Nobody used to walk around, and now everybody's walking around, because it's kind of the only thing we have.
Yeah, it makes you appreciate those things much more. And I even, people are like waving at each other and things like that. And there's just like a need to connect again, because we've been so disconnected, because just being connected over electronics isn't enough for us.
It's really not. And I think, the advances of having the internet during this time have been, godsends for all of us. And I'm very thankful for them. And, I love connecting with my friends and doing FaceTime and seeing my patients on Zoom and stuff. And I'm teaching classes on Zoom, and I'm able to connect, and I'm still interacting with people, but it's just a different experience. So it fills some part of your cup, but it doesn't fill everything.
What class are you teaching?
Oh, I'm teaching a lot of classes. Teaching at 3 schools right now. At an acupuncture school here in Texas, I'm teaching women's health and biomedical diagnostic techniques. I teach anatomy and physiology and Western medical terminology at OCOM, which is an acupuncture school in Portland. And I teach men's health at NUNM this term. So I got a lot going on with teaching.
How was that experience in general? Do you find that pretty rewarding?
Teaching in general, I love teaching. Teaching on Zoom has been, it's been challenging to adjust to that, because these classes were not set up as online classes. And so figuring out, like, how do I engage students? How do I get them, interested in the material when I'm not there in person? And how do I not make it so boring, like sitting on a Zoom lecture, listening to somebody talk for 3 hours? That's a lot. So it's been an adjustment.
Yeah, I think one needs to go about it in a very, conscious and different way. Teaching courses for Portland Community College, I've noticed that you have to take into account that it's Zoom. You have to go out of your way to make it engaging. You have to go out of your way to make sure everyone's on board, or else it's just going to be you just lecturing. It's going to be terrible. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. It's just going to get dull.
Are your classes, because they're herb classes, right? So is there like an in-person component of that, or are they doing the exercises at home?
No, there's no in-person. So PCC right now is, I believe, until the end of winter. As of now, there's no in-person classes, so they're fully on Zoom. But what I do with my students is I tell them, a week or two ahead of time, like what materials to bring to the class, and then I do like a demonstration
Cool.
This one ended up actually very good because I did a class during the summer, and it honestly, like, it was like one of my first Zoom classes. So I wasn't ready for how, like, you just talk into a screen type aspect, where I was like, I don't know if I have 2 hours of nonstop talking prepared. Like, I'm used to like back and forth and someone asking questions, but it was just like silent audience. So this time I went in and I was like, okay, like make sure to build in the engaging aspects into it, or else like you're just setting yourself up for failure. And I think that helps a lot with
it does. You've got to build in those little breaks and questions and breakout groups and all that kind of stuff, because otherwise it's not only boring for the students, but also, yeah, as an instructor, you're just like, oh my gosh, how do I fill the time? What do I do?
yeah, exactly. And that's not the feeling you get when a class is going really well. And in person,
Oh,
that almost never happens, because it's like, if you're in a small environment, there's this principle of human psychology that no one wants to be the first person to ask a question type of
yeah,
thing. But when you're in person, like, you could be like, hey, what do you think? And like kind of almost like force engagement. But once that opens up, then the whole room becomes more engaged. But online, it's a little bit more difficult, because it's like you're just seeing boxes on your screen. It's not like you can like point to someone and go, hey, what do you think, Michelle?
I think that, yeah, that principle is just amplified on the internet. Like, really, nobody wants to ask a question, and then there's always like, the delay with Zoom, and so you've already kind of moved on, and they're like, oh, I actually had and it's it's
Yeah.
distracting, and it's just a whole thing. But I think that students are getting more and more used to that kind of learning, and that makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, this starting this Friday and for the next following 4 weeks, I'm teaching a dream interpretation class again,
Cool.
round two. That one was really fun. That was another one where, like, on the first week of it, like, I was just like, I don't know if I want to teach. Like, it was because there was so much like dense, specific information that I was going through, and there was like so little engagement that I was just
Yeah.
like, I can't talk at this high level for 2 hours. Like, I'm gonna have to prepare for 20 hours for this 2 hour class.
Yep.
Um,
I know the feeling.
but I figured it out that it's like, you know, make it fun, make it engaging. Don't like worry too much about being perfect, but worry about like making sure everyone gets what they want and they have a good experience. Cause that's really what it's about. It's like they're gonna forget 80% of what you say anyway, if not
Mhm.
more. So like, but they'll remember good experiences and insights they had. So just focus in on that stuff that matters. And
Totally.
then the next class was just like a million times better.
With your dream interpretation class, are you weaving herbs into that? Because I know you
Yeah,
obviously
yeah.
care a lot about herbs.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a section, I think it was in like the second week of it, that I went into different dream herbs like Kalia Zakatachichi, which is called dream herb,
Hmm.
um, used by, I believe, ancient peoples in Mexico. So they would take it as a sacrament, go to sleep, and it would help increase their dreams. There was some recent research on it that showed that when you take it during the day, it doesn't change your consciousness, but only when you fall asleep does it change your dream state. So it's an
Cool.
interesting herb. It's incredibly bitter. It's pretty dang disgusting. I made it as a tea one time. Big mistake. It was the most bitter thing I ever tasted in my life. It was like drinking pharmaceuticals crushed up.
Gross.
And so typically it's smoked. But that's, yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff with that.
How do you? So I know Oregon on the ballot this year. There's mushrooms or psilocybin, one of the two.
Hmm.
It, I don't know. Is that for medical or recreational or what?
That's for yeah, so that's what is that called? IP, I think it's called IP 34. I forget which number it is
Yeah.
specifically, but it's to create a system where certain practitioners can give it in a kind of medical context, but it would be like a separate thing. It's not like if you're an MD, you automatically can. It's more of you
Gotcha.
have to go through this like certification course or something of that matter. But yeah, it's in more of a medical type of model, therapeutic usage of
Hmm.
psilocybin and other psychedelics, but not like recreational. Like if you're 21, you could go buy it. It's like they have to be these centers and they have to be certified practitioners,
Gotcha.
and you have to follow some kind of rules, which I think is a good way to start it off.
Yeah, I think in our system, that's the way to start. I've been interested with the debate about like how entheogen herbs are illegal, right? Like these substances that traditional cultures have used as a way to, enhance their dreams or enhance visions or like connect with the spiritual realm. Like we just outlawed all of those, and you know, it's it's interesting to me that we have to start with like, okay, we'll bring it in slowly with like a medical model, and then eventually maybe we can open it up. But um, I don't know. What do you think about all of that?
I think fundamentally change is very scary for humans, and like the kind of change that entheogen psychedelics bring in people's minds and in culture and in society was so big and so sudden that anyone in any position of power was like, we can't have this
Mm,
we can't have people like this is not good. They're, you know, in the streets, like protesting and, flower power and all this stuff, and they just didn't know what to do with it, so they just
yeah,
got rid of it.
people are in the streets protesting now too.
Yeah.
So
Well, they'll probably make something, they'll outlaw something to get them off the
yeah,
streets, whatever it
seriously.
is that they use.
Yeah, I'm I have not used entheogens really myself because yeah, that mental change is scary to me too, and I think that's where a lot of it comes from, is like that discomfort with feeling out of control and feeling out of like, my comfort zone. I'm a Taurus, so I really like structure and comfort and predictability.
Yeah, my brother's a Taurus.
Like at my core, that's just what I am. So,
Yeah, that's the thing with these entheogen psychedelics. They bring about a big change, and they're not necessarily always pleasant
mhm,
experiences. In fact, they're usually kind of up and downs, and of very, highest blisses to like deepest terrors, just kind of oscillating.
right.
Um, and it has its own inherent risks and dangers.
Mhm,
More of a psychological nature. I mean, the LD50, or the lethal dose that kills 50% of experimental subjects, is like non-existent for LSD.
right.
They couldn't even find it. So
Yeah.
they're physiologically, they're pretty much harmless, but
Mhm,
psychologically they can catalyze change so much that it might not be a good change. These aren't like these are going to save us all type things that people believed in the 70s. But I think therapeutically and for people's own spiritual growth and finding meaning in their life, there's no tool that's even close to it in terms of, especially for mental health. There's a big movement towards microdosing things like
mhm.
psilocybin, and I found it to be incredibly powerful. Just stabilizing mood and keeping one in a kind of good centered place without, not necessarily tripping out, but
Right.
as a medicine. So I I really support the use of psychedelics as a medicine. I don't necessarily like the super clinical aspect of it. I don't necessarily
Mhm.
want like it to be like you come into a doctor's office and it's like white wall and like he's got a stethoscope and he gives you some psilocybin like a tablet. I don't think
Right.
that gives its true due, because going back to that ritual aspect of it, in these kind of psychedelic entheogen sphere, the ritual is 10 times more important there than it is in normal life, because your mind is already so open that, you know if somebody is there with you and you're in the right kind of environment, you got some music, maybe someone's playing like a drum or something like that. It's when you're on psilocybin, that person there is the difference between like a pretty cool experience and like you going literally to another universe and like meeting God. Like that's the difference between the kind of environment. So that's the kind of thing that I guess people would be able to do what they wanted to do with it in terms of practitioners, but I wouldn't want to see it over clinicalized, because I think that would be a really big disservice. I think it would be better if it was more, anybody with a certain certification. Definitely, like, I think it would be fair to have a few months of schooling or something like that on all the dangers and how to know when to not allow people to use and stuff. Like, not necessarily people just with medical degrees. I think that it should be open to anyone who wants to be a kind of guide. But
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you touched on something that's really, that we already talked about a little bit, is that ritual aspect. And, like the ritual of going to the doctor is one thing. Taking entheogens out of context and out of the ritual is a different thing. Like you're medicalizing something that was, traditionally a very transformative, changing, altering experience. And it was the whole experience of the thing that made you open to what this plant has for you. So it's kind of like, for me, the difference between when we use herbs as whole plants and herbs as constituents. Like they don't, it doesn't work quite the same. It's not the same thing to take berberine or hydrastis. They're different. They have, it's a whole thing versus a single aspect.
yeah, and in these states, you see and experience things that you didn't think were possible on a just regular basis. It's very incongruent with typical waking consciousness.
Right.
And the idea of there being plant spirits is way more apparent in those states where people have experiences of, I've heard a lot, and also myself, I've had the experience of feeling like the plant was actually guiding me and instructing me. It came as my own voice, but it had such a directedness that it wasn't up to my control. It was like, look at this. Like, oh, what do you think about this thing that happened in your life? Oh, like connect these things. But it was like, it was guiding. It wasn't just me, snowballing. It wasn't conscious. It was more like something was trying to show me something. I don't know if it was, my own spirit, my own higher consciousness, my subconscious mind, the plant, who knows? But the experience is a very personal one. It feels like something is trying to communicate with you, which is very, very strange to experience.
Yeah. Do you have any experience with Artemisia absinthium or absinthe?
Yeah, I have one experience with, actually I have two experiences with it. So the first experience, I had some absinthe from Italy, where they still make it in the traditional way. It's not illegal as it became in the States to have the active constituents. And I remember it was like minorly psychedelic. Like I was drinking outside with some friends and like everything seemed so bright and kind of shiny, but it wasn't anything too wild. Then a second time, trying to relive that experience, I bought some wormwood, which is obviously the main component in absinthe is from wormwood. And I made a really, really strong tea. And like, don't do that. Don't do that ever. Like
Why?
I pretty much like poisoned myself.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I did a really, really high dose. The reason why they take it out of it and like they had to go through this whole process for absinthe is because like the compounds in that plant are actually pretty toxic in high doses. I didn't know this at the time, but I drank like a full cup of, I don't even know, must have been like 30, 40 grams. It was just an insane amount of tea to drink of any kinds, especially of this. I should have known by the bitterness that this was something that I shouldn't have finished, because it was like that deathly bitter where you drink it and it feels bitter on the back of your tongue for like 30 seconds after you take one sip. It's like that like warning signal bitterness. But I drank the whole cup and I just started feeling kind of like groggy and not good, kind of drowsy. And I went to sleep and I woke up in the morning like I was completely blacked out all night. Like I don't remember any of my dreams, but I woke up and I felt like I woke up out of a crypt or something. Like I was just really depressed and I was just like really messed up. And I talked to my friends who I also, I was like, we should, try this wormwood or whatever. I was stupid. I didn't like, this was before I was really a herbalist. So I was just kind of, this is back in my experimentation phase.
Yeah.
So I cut myself some slack there, but my friend also did it. And he had a similar experience. He didn't take as much as me, so I don't think he poisoned himself. But he said that he explained his dream to me, and it was like the most archetypal, strange, mystical dream. And he was also a little bit messed up the next day. But then I read into wormwood, and it's like energetically, it's a very strange plant. Like it's known to grow in graveyards and things of that nature. It has like this very like deathly aspect to it. Not necessarily bad. That's what it's kind of used for, like this kind of the more dark side of life exploration. But yeah, definitely don't make homemade wormwood tea unless you have worms or parasites, which is really good for, by the way.
It is, yes. I just listened to a little lecture with Guido Masse, who's an herbalist in Vermont, and he was talking about wormwood as a bitter, but also as a as a bitter agent that influenced the mind. So it's like it's able to, as its bitter constituents, like it's very cooling and grounding and draws energy down, but then it also like elevates the mind, and it's this like it's a European entheogen basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that used in smaller doses, it definitely has a lot of healing potential. In terms of bitters, it's among the most bitter. I think it's just about as bitter as gentian is, which
Mm-hmm.
is just like unbelievably bitter in like a tea or a tincture form. Um, but yeah, it kind of brings up a good point about herbal medicine and herbalism in general, is that like uh be careful, because like some plants are toxic in higher doses, and like it's not worth like experimenting on yourself when that information's out there. Like, so if you're
Absolutely.
gonna make a really high dose tea for yourself, like just do a quick search, like, is this toxic? And don't believe like the propaganda articles, but like, because there's plenty of them about how herbs will kill you and things like that. But
Mm.
actually, the amount of herbs that are toxic that are in use are relatively few. So you could pretty much go through most herbs and you won't have any problem. But every once in a while, you got your, you got your wormwood, you got your aconite, you got, poke root in high doses and things like that that could be pretty toxic.
Yeah, I see that a lot too with essential oils. That is a offshoot of herbal medicine in
Mhm.
some ways. Like essential oils are used some in herbal medicine. I think there's debate in the herbalism community about how related that actually is, but I see people like really going hard with essential oils and consuming them, orally,
Internally,
and
yeah.
just putting them on with like no carrier oils because they read somewhere that it was safe. And it's like, oh, you really got to be careful with stuff. Like just because something comes from nature does not mean it's not going to mess you
Right.
up.
And essential oils aren't that natural in terms of,
Not at all.
because they go through so much processing to get there. It's not the same thing as just picking a plant and eating it. Uh, and it hyper concentrates it to an amount that maybe some plant that would be completely harmless if you take it in high enough doses. Like, God forbid you have some like garlic essential oil or some cinnamon essential oil, like it'll straight up just kill you. Like it'll just burn through your throat. It's
Yeah,
too much.
exactly.
It's already
Well,
in and
and
of itself, it's already strong.
it's like what a drop of essential oil is like 30 cups of tea or something.
Yeah,
I've heard someone make that like
it's an insane
conversion.
amount of plant matter that goes into making just a small amount of essential oil. Uh, you bring up an interesting question of like, is essential oils part of herbalism? And I would say that it is, but it's like it's kind of like almost like the pharmaceutical version of herbalism, as are like different extracts that just focus on one compound, because essential oils are predominantly like one or a few compounds, as are different extracts of one compound. But as we were talking about, there's something to be said about the synergistic effect of all of the herbs together. Um, and it's interesting, and it's pretty common that sometimes an herb will have a compound in it that's like slightly toxic, but it has another compound that counters it within the same herb, and that's pretty typical.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that it is a kind of herbal medicine, but it's not. I would say it's a kind of herbal medicine, but it's not herbalism. Maybe that's the distinction I would make, because I think herbalism is really more about like it's a holistic approach, like seeing not the whole person, but seeing the whole plant and like understanding the plant from a biochemical standpoint. What does it do physiologically in the body, and also what is what's the energy of that plant? What's the spirit of that plant? What's the I don't know, like what is that plant as an entity?
As almost even a personality, as a
Yeah,
being. What are they? What powers do they have? Because
exactly.
that's how I think of how herbs can be very healing to us. We're, in a sense, when we ingest an herb or taking an herb into our bodies, we're taking the adaptations or the powers of that plant. If there's this idea that in plant energetics, like plants could be hot, cold, dry, and damp, uh, meaning there's a lot to get into, but very, very simply, hot Hot herbs tend to be very stimulating, increase temperature. They tend to basically quicken processes. Cold herbs tend to do the opposite, sedate, calm down, slow. Dry tend to kind of constrict. It's a lot of the astringents. And then damp, like moisten, lubricate, and kind of relax out tissues. What's interesting is there's a strong correlation that I've heard of, at least in the herbalism community, that uh, if a plant, let's say it like grows in like a swamp or something, that plant's going to be very good for damp conditions just because it like is adapted and evolved to be able to withstand the stresses of like a damp area. So when you ingest it, you're doing the same thing because there's obviously environmental influences. So that's a cool way of thinking about herbs, is you're taking in their evolutionary advantage essentially into your body so that you could have it also.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that really that that goes along with like understanding the personality of the plant. You know, like it's it's not just a physiologic mechanism. It's like it's something that that plant has evolved to do. It's part of who that plant is. And I think that that's part of the art of like prescribing herbal medicine, that a lot of, you know, like integrative doctors and stuff, they will use herbs in their practice, but not maybe in the same way that we would use them, because they're more focused on like, I use X to treat Y. Like there, it's not that art. It's not the art piece. It's like when people ask me like, oh, what herbs do I use for anxiety? It's like, well, I don't know. I don't know what your anxiety is like. Like,
Right.
you know, is it that your mind is racing and you're really, you know, stressed out? Is it that you're just worried about everything? Is it that, you know, you have specific certain kinds of anxiety about, you know, public speaking, or you just, or they're just in the moment kinds of anxiety? Like there's so many different ways that you can describe things. And I think that's how we like really take plants in an artful way and figure out what is that, who does that fit?
Yeah, herbalism is an incredibly complex art. It has, you know, thousands of years of people working on it, and all that information is there. But in the last like 50 or so years, almost all that has been thrown away, and it's just, what does the research say, which is, you know, it completely misses out on the deeper aspects of it, because as you were saying with something like anxiety, it's like an herbalist doesn't even view it as that. They view it as, you have this symptom, that symptom, your constitution's like this. These are your other, you know, things that are happening. This is what it was triggered by. And through that mechanism, you find a plant, not just because they have anxiety. It's like the anxiety is just like one of many things that might tell you which herb to use. Because if you're just going to go based on the anxiety thing, then, you know, you're going to have either 100 herbs that all treat anxiety and none of them will work because you didn't find one that actually helps with it. So it's a kind of like, I think of it in terms of patterns. Like somebody has like a disease pattern, and the herb can kind of move around the pattern. They can, and I think of it energetically, not in terms of like that there's some kind of physical energy, but energetically, as in there's some kind of pattern that we can't describe that changes when you give this herb, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we, you know, in school we learn that with homeopathy. We learn that kind of pattern differentiation, and like we see polycrest remedies in different ways, and we're able to identify that a little bit more easily. I think that herbs work that way too, though, right? Like you were saying, it's not just about treating the anxiety; it's about the entire constitution of the person. It's like there's never just one symptom. There's never just one thing with anybody going on, and I think we can also apply that, you know, in our practice as naturopathic doctors to dietary changes, nutrients. Like someone has anxiety and hypertension and constipation, well, magnesium is a really great option for them, right? Like that's a nutrient option. If they have anxiety and trouble sleeping and they're really stressed out, maybe I would go with ashwagandha instead, you know, like, so I think we can kind of broaden that pattern differentiation piece to include all of those tools that we have, which is really cool to me.
That's a good point. And I think I would say that that's what differentiates naturopathic doctors from other physicians in general, is that at least through our education and our roots, we're very founded on this idea of treating the whole person. which other practitioners do as well. But from within the context of Western medicine and Western science, which is kind of a new thing. It's kind of a thing yet to, I would say, yet to even be discovered and fully understood. How you can integrate what we know from science and uh, modern medicine and still treat holistically in terms of you're not too focused on one part of them. You're focused on the whole person and how do you bring the whole person to health as an entity, which they are obviously. Science just splits them up into parts, but that's an abstraction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. I think that's the nugget, right? Like that's the key of how we're different is that it's not what we're giving a patient. Anybody can give a patient herbs or homeopathy or nutrients or diet. Anybody can do that. It's how we see the person and how, like, what questions do we ask? How are we relating these things together? How are we really like, what is that experience of like working with the patient? Like that's the difference between, like you said, between like splitting it up into pieces and looking at the whole entity.
I think it's incredibly hard to be truly holistic because of just biases and tendencies and us like not just going based on what we already know and experienced instead of questioning that. Like, for example, like let's say a patient comes in and they have anxiety. If you're an herbalist, you might be pretty quick to say, okay, this herb, that herb, this herb. Here's a formula. I help you with your anxiety. Or even if you get their symptoms, maybe you even get like a very deep explanation of their life and their energy and everything, and you still give them a formula. But what if that person's anxiety is like very specifically caused by some person in their lives and you just didn't ask about it, so you didn't find out, and all it maybe what it took is just a conversation about that and maybe some boundary setting or leaving that relationship, and their anxiety would have completely went away. But here you are giving them herbs to help them perpetuate a condition that's not good for them. So it's like, to be truly holistic, you have to be ready to doubt yourself all the time, uh, because to find what, and obviously it's not so black and white where there's like one cause of anxiety, obviously, but I think there can be like a predominant factor that is like a recurring theme in their anxiety or their depression that needs to find out. And there could be a lot of ways to hit it at once.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think that what you said about like being holistic, you have to be willing to doubt yourself. That's really important. And it's really hard when you're a new doc, right? Like when we're new, we really don't want to doubt ourselves. We want to be very, very sure that we're right and that we did all the work and we put in all this time and we picked the one right thing and that's going to fix everything. And I will just tell you that doesn't happen very frequently. Like it's trial and error. It's going back to the drawing board all the time and taking in new information and like thinking to yourself, like, what have I not asked? What have I not assessed? What have I not evaluated? And how could that be making impacting the case? Which is exciting. That's the practice of medicine, right? Like we're always practicing.
Medicine in that sense is such an interesting profession and so different from other professions because as a lawyer, there is a right answer. It's precedent. There's this, that's that, that's the law. You make a new law. It's there. Everything is in computer science. It's like that as well. There's, a certain law that you have to function on, certain code, and, or an architect, the building either stands or it doesn't, either looks good or it doesn't. There's not any gray area. But with the medicine, everything's a gray area because the body is so complex and so mysterious, even now to us, that it still is largely art based, meaning
Yeah.
that you're kind of going with the best from science and from this and that. But at the end of the day, you don't really know what helped the person.
Well, yeah, and it's also all of those things and individual, right? Like just because something worked for one patient doesn't mean it's going to work
Yeah.
for
So
someone
that
else.
just compounds it even more.
Yeah, and I think when we're, I have a background in research. I'm the research director for whole systems healthcare. I love research, but I think interpreting research in a clinical way and saying that like, okay, in the study there was a significant difference between the treatment group and the control group. Well, what was that difference? Like what did it actually change clinically? Or how many people were helped by this? How many people were not? Was it, 90% of people got better, or was it 51% of people got better? So like just because something is proven with a study doesn't mean that it is going to work for your patient or is not going to work for your patient, because there's so much biochemical and emotional and, historical
Mhm.
individuality.
The way I like to use research is proving something that I already know and proving to a patient something that probably, if you factor in the kind of ritual aspect, there's such a like subconscious belief in research that you just showing somebody that, oh, this research really does show that it helps this and that for anxiety. Maybe you're picking it because of deep reasons like
Mm-hmm.
deep herbalism, energetics, constitution, but then you have the research to show them, oh, this could actually really work for you, even if you don't believe in all this woo-woo energetic stuff. See, this
Right.
science says it works. I didn't pick it based on the science because, I mean, all it told me is that it helps for anxiety, which is useless because that's like almost every herb can be said to help for anxiety if you study it in a certain way.
Yeah, it's a good. I agree. I think, clinically speaking, it's a really good tool for helping us figure out. It's a tool, just like historical use with herbalism, tradition, ritual, all those pieces. It's a tool to use. But I love it when the research lines up with historical use or
Yeah.
what I'm thinking of it, because yeah, it just makes it that much more powerful for the patient. And I think, they trust you a lot more if you're like, oh, I actually have research. You're like, okay, you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I can, and I think the more you get people to buy in with that, the more they start trusting you. And it's like, okay, maybe this other stuff, like the energetics and that more woo
Mhm.
woo out there kind of stuff that I thought was crazy, maybe there's something to that too.
Well, it's a process, and what I love about the Chinese medicine herbalism approach is they don't think of it in terms of you have this condition, I give you this herb formula, and that's it. It's like give you this herb formula, come back next week, tell me what changed. Oh, this changed. Okay, let me take one herb out, put another one in, and just it's a process, just like we are. It's not like there's one herb that's right for you, one formula that's right for you. It's like it's changing based on what's happening. And when it becomes
Totally.
dynamic like that, I think that's when it has a real healing potential that is probably even beyond pharmaceuticals if you use it in that
I
manner.
I agree, and I feel that way about homeopathy too. And homeopathy and herbalism, it's a Venn diagram. Like homeopathy includes some of the same herbs. It's a whole thing. But I think, in school we hear a lot about like the constitutional remedy, and you have to get the constitutional remedy, that one single remedy that's going to like match the resonance of that person and fix everything. And in my mind, like that's silly, because everything's constantly changing. And so I really like approaching that kind of practice, herbs, energetic herbs from an energetic standpoint in that same way of like, I gave you this, what shifted? How do I switch it now? Like where are you vibrating now? Where are you resonating now? Like what's the energy like now? Because it changes all the time.
And this is a really key point for anybody who's interested in herbalism or natural healing or holistic medicine in general to really consider is where are you trying to bring them?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you don't know where you're trying to bring them, you're just shooting in the dark and hoping that something good happens. But if you have an idea of where you want to bring them, like let's say somebody, has poor digestion, and where do you want to bring them? Obviously better digestion. What would bring better digestion? Stimulating digestion, maybe changing up their diet, maybe some movement would be helpful to them. You try all that stuff. Oh, it worked. Okay, we can add this, take away this. Oh, it didn't work at all. Maybe the whole stimulating digestion thing isn't true. Maybe that's not what I need to do. But like if you don't know where you're going, you don't know if you didn't get there. And you're
Yeah,
just
that's a good
constantly
point.
just throwing stuff. But that part is like that's such high level medicine that it's probably you have to be a master to really do that. Like
Yeah.
in a way that you can be confident that you're going where you want to go with it.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of practice and trial and error until you get there, right? Like you see what works for patients and what doesn't work for them, and that's always kind of building your mental notebook of like, okay, now I can kind of figure out that leading them where I want to go with these therapeutics a little bit easier. But yeah, it takes a lot of time, and
I
we're
think
both still new, so.
I think using the herbs yourself is the best way to know. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you drink chamomile tea every day, you start to get a feel for like what is chamomile? What is the effect of chamomile? Oh, it makes my mind feel like this. It makes my body feel like this. It makes you get a certain feel for it. and you notice what it helps you with. You notice, oh, if I'm agitated, I drink some chamomile, just instantly. You start picking all these things up. And then when you see it, you'll know it. You'll be like, oh, that person needs chamomile. They're having the same symptoms that I had when I drank chamomile, and it totally helped. So like 9 times out of 10, it'll probably help them. But
Yeah,
you
and
have
I
to
think
know
that,
it from within.
yeah, and
There's a lot of
patients,
book knowledge.
they like it too when you have some kind of, experience with stuff. Like even with diets or foods or whatever, like it's so much more powerful when I'm like, I've done an elimination diet before. I know how much it sucks. I know how hard it is. Here's what I use to get through. Maybe that'll work for you. Just like you're coming to them with like, I don't know. It's a more human perspective in a lot of ways. Of like, I have also experienced this. This is what I came away with. Like this is how I'm going to help you with that. I think there's danger in that in some ways. Like we don't want to influence what a patient is going to think or feel about certain treatments, but I also think that from a more human standpoint, understanding where your patients are coming from, especially if, they haven't tried natural medicine before, or they haven't tried changing their diet or adding movement. I think being able to give them examples and like have a real world approach is really helpful.
Mm. So true. There's the idea of practice what you preach is so important in especially the more natural health spheres where our interventions are based around changing your life, changing your diet, changing your mind. That if you're not doing those things, it's really hard to get through to somebody. Um, and what I've noticed is that the things that I've tried for myself and I really found worked, it's so much easier to get patient buy-in when you suggest those things because subconsciously you're talking about it differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're like, this diet, I tried this is so cool, it worked for this is what I noticed, and people are like, oh, that sounds awesome. But if you're like, I read in some research that this and that, but you've never tried it, like it doesn't have the same like depth to it
Yeah,
that it would
yeah,
if you knew for yourself what this thing was that you're recommending.
yeah, because you're not making a connection based on it. It's just kind of like, I'm making a recommendation. But yeah, I agree with that. I also think it can be important, not with every patient, but like it can also be important to share times when we like have failed at doing those things. Like I all the time, admit to patients like I would love for you to eat less sugar. I know how hard that is because you know what? I had a donut last night, or I ate half a pint of ice cream this weekend because that's what I wanted to do. Like humanizing yourself a little bit and taking yourself down from that, like, the doctor-patient relationship is very important, but that like power differential and power dynamic, I think can actually be really damaging for people if they think that they can't be honest with you about how they're feeling or how the treatments are working. And I always want my patients to be able to tell me like, this worked, this made me feel weird, this didn't do anything at all. Like, cool, that's information for me that I can use to change what I'm telling you so that we can get to that next step.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's so difficult to change your lifestyle, and you only know that if you tried yourself. And I think the humanizing aspect, it opens the door for the person you're recommending this change to not feel like they're a failure when they inevitably will fail, because it's actually part of the process.
Yeah.
But if you can say, I tried this and I failed, but here's what I did when I failed, then you've just given the best advice that you could possibly give, because you've not only told about the pitfall, but you told them how to get out of it.
Yeah.
And normalized it. I'm not like, you said on this diet, there's going to be days when you eat a bunch of donuts. Like, it's just going to happen. You can't like be ready for it. And like, this is the plan of action. Don't beat yourself up. Just, don't do anything crazy. Just the next day, just get back to your normal thing. Don't take such a big deal. And that kind of stuff is the difference between those normal parts of the process derailing the whole lifestyle change, or it actually making it very strong and long lasting, because there is space for failure within it.
Absolutely.
As a normal part of it.
I think with like natural healing, natural health, on social media especially, like there's a very narrow definition of what natural medicine and like living naturally is, and it's a very certain kind of aesthetic and person. And I think a lot of times people who don't fit that are like, oh, I can never do that. I can't like I can't make those diet changes. I can't exercise like that because I'm not that person already. And so I think it's important for, us to be real with our patients and be like, some of the stuff is really hard that I'm asking you to do. It will work for you because I've been down this path, I've done this journey, but I think that like representation matters. Representation also matters when we can tell our patients like it's okay to mess up because I also mess up. I've seen doctors that I worked with in my residency and my internship at NUNM share with patients like, I don't like taking supplements either. Like, I'm not very good at it, so I'm going to only choose 2 for you. Is that okay? And the patient's like, oh my gosh, yes, thank you so much. Like, I don't want 20 supplements. I just want a couple. So I think that's, like, humanizing medicine, I don't know. I just feel like it's more effective. And then the patients trust you, and then they want to come back to you. They want to see you. They want to work with you. And that's really the key, right? Like, in a lot of ways, we're not doing the healing. We're just kind of coaching you along and giving you tools at different stops along the way, and you're doing the work.
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that a lot of doctors they feel like they have to like show a certain side because they feel like the patient won't trust them anymore. They'll lose respect for them if, like, how can somebody tell me all these things if they themselves can't do it, and those kind of ideas.
Yeah, I think it's a real balancing act because we are doctors and we are held to a higher standard in a lot of ways. And so I think it's important, like you said, practice what you preach for sure. But I think like allowing patients to see that you're a human too is also just really important. There was that big debate recently about the, I don't know if she was a resident or an intern, but she shared like a bikini photo on her, or no, maybe she was like an internal medicine doc. Shared a bikini photo on her social media, and people like lost their minds. They're like, you're a doctor, you can't be in a bikini, you can't show that. And she's like, I'm a human being, like this is my personal account, like I can do what I want. So I think that, and we were talking about social media quite a bit before we started recording, but like, that balancing act on social media I think is also really interesting as a topic. So like how perfect do we appear, and does that help us with patients, or does that turn a lot of patients off from us?
Yeah, that's a good question. Something I've definitely thought a lot about, and maybe it's something of a balance aspect because you don't want to pretend to be perfect.
Yeah.
But it's also like not about us as doctors. Like it's not about our problems and our struggles. Like
exactly.
It's only insofar as like that story is helpful for them. Otherwise, like why even share it?
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's like, I don't tell every single patient that I ate, 2 donuts yesterday. Like that's not relevant. If someone's really struggling with like, I'm struggling with a diet or something, that's a relevant time to be like, I totally get it. Here's what I did. Like it's that balance piece. And again, I think that goes back to the art of medicine, right? It's knowing when to share and when to just listen and when to, give a little part of yourself for that doctor-patient relationship and when to like keep it back.
It's fundamentally a very humanistic profession. You're dealing with people, you're dealing with their lives, their emotions, their personalities, the things that matter most to them. People come in and tell their doctors things that they don't tell their wives and husbands. Like it's a very it's a privileged position in terms of being able to make an influence in somebody's life. And I'd say for that reason, it's so important for us to try to live to the highest ideals that we possibly can, while also realizing we're still humans because of that potential positive or negative influence we could have on somebody's life if we're careful or not careful.
Agreed. It is quite a responsibility for sure.
What how do you feel about that social media type of thing? Like, should a doctor be only very doctorly on their Instagram, or like are they a person on social media, or should they have 2 accounts?
I have 2 accounts. I have a doctor account where I do doctor things, and I have my personal account where I do my personal things. And not that anything I do on like my personal account's like crazy wild, but like, I think it's
Just on
important for
personal account, just eating donuts, and doctor account, it's like you can't eat sugar ever. Sugar's the devil. Like, completely contradictory.
I would never do that. No, I think it's important for doctors to like, have a life too, and for the public to understand like doctors are also people and they also have, personal lives outside of just work. Like we're not always doctors 24/7. I guess in some ways we are, but like we take that hat off sometimes.
Mhm. There was like an archetype of the doctor that exists that I think that if it's not fulfilled, it makes people like lose trust. I think that's what that bikini photo is about. I don't think that it's some, I don't know. I don't think that it's necessarily some kind of like overall sexism or something like that, that happened. Of course, some people who were outraged about it, that was what it was about.
Mhm.
But I think it's like there's this image of the doctor that's like this thing. And if you do something that's like not that, like, oh, you couldn't possibly be like a doctor.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
how a doctor behaves. And it's this ingrained idea of what a doctor is.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think sexism, certainly plays a part in that for sure because, um, as a society, we really want women to be over sexualized, but then completely not sexual at all
Mm-hmm,
ever.
mm-hmm.
And it's like a bikini in and of itself is not inherently sexual, but we will make it about that. But again, that's a perception thing. Like she's not doing that to be, sexual. It's like everybody else's perception of that. And that's the perception of like, well, a doctor cannot do that. Like I can't see my doctor in that. It's like you're not seeing your doctor in that anyway. So like
Yeah.
it's I think the same thing happens with like ministers as well. Like there's a lot of kind of like edgy, cool ministers now who have like a bunch of tattoos and stuff and like, are very like radical love kind of preachers. But a lot of people really don't like that because
Yeah.
that's not how people
Doesn't
of
fit into the mold of what they think it
exactly.
should be. And
Yeah.
I find that so like the profession of doctor, or really any profession, it can become a kind of like identity
Mm-hmm.
where like one feels like they can't act that side of the norm. So we were talking a little bit before about, living to highest ideals. But what I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking here is a little bit different. It's like being limited by your role as a doctor. Oh, doctors don't do
Yeah.
this. Doctors don't say this, even if it's
Yeah.
what you believe, even if you think it's beneficial.
Yeah. It's there's challenges to that. I think, especially now with social media and just honestly how off the rails social media can get sometimes with
Mm-hmm.
people sharing opinions that are not uh, not popular. I think there's a lot of challenges associated with like having an opinion as a doctor and having an opinion about health because we like to think of health as one way, but not everybody agrees with us. And especially being doctors in the minority of being naturopathic doctors, like mainstream medicine does not agree with us on everything. And so even, sharing our opinions about using herbs instead of, pharmaceuticals, or in addition to like that can be seen as very inflammatory by some people.
Mm-hmm. Thankfully, I think the general populace has had a shift in view towards those things, uh, which is really good for just
Yeah,
natural healing in general. But yeah, especially in the ivory tower type spheres, it's still very scoffed at. That's typically the
absolutely.
people very like academic, or just go on Reddit and just you know see for yourself. People who haven't gone to naturopathic school, have never seen a naturopath talk in detail of how terrible they are with
Yeah.
no really insight into what they're talking about.
Yeah. Never read the comments online, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Always
exactly.
the worst.
Yeah, it's not good. And our Wikipedia page is still pretty terrible.
Oh yeah, our Wikipedia page is very biased and
There's like a
terrible.
there's like a war going on in the Wikipedia page. I don't know if you ever looked into the like history of all the changes that happens to the
Mm-hmm.
page, but people have been trying to make changes for like years and it just keeps getting blocked.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think the best bet of naturopathic medicine is not to try to necessarily become conventional medicine. plus herbs, but to just follow our path of, our roots and who we can be, and how do we integrate that into the system rather than the other way around. Rather, how do we change ourselves to fit in? How do we, how do we work our way in? How do we bring what we have? What's our place there?
Yeah, I agree. I think healthcare works best when you have a team, when you have, people from all kinds of different perspectives being able to advise you, because sometimes natural medicine works much better for conditions. Sometimes conventional medicine, like if I break my arm or bust my leg or something, I'm gonna go to the hospital. I'm gonna get a cast
Right.
and have somebody set it for me. Like, that's what they're good at. They're really great at that. If I have diabetes or hypertension, probably gonna choose a more natural approach, because it's like everything has its time, everything has its skills and ability, and I think honoring those differences is really important.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think it's so important, regardless of what you believe, to have open space for understanding the usefulness and place of another viewpoint that you don't necessarily agree with.
Yeah.
So, what would you say that our profession is particularly good at? Like, why would someone go see a naturopath and not an MD and not a chiropractor and not, a psychologist?
Yeah. Well, I think all the things we talked about, just like seeing the whole person and trying to figure out those patterns and fit all the pieces together, and really seeing you just as a person, not as just a symptom. That's one reason. But also, I think how we treat chronic disease, especially, is just it's a better way, right? Like, we're more holistic and really trying to treat multiple different angles of someone's life when they have a chronic disease like Hashimoto's thyroiditis or hypertension or depression, or those kinds of things that, like, they don't respond super well to conventional medicine. Like this, we can manage the symptoms with pharmaceuticals, but like that's kind of it. We're not actually like changing anything that got you to that point.
I agree. I think that point of chronic disorders is a really key thing. And in general, I think chronic disorders come from an imbalance in the body that comes over time. So it can only be changed over time, theoretically. Then if it takes, 5 years to build, then it's going to take maybe not 5 years to fix, but it's definitely going to take a while. There's not going to be any quick fix from any camp. But
No.
I think naturopathic doctors are really well equipped for the long haul of, month to month, and change this and change that and add this and take this away. And here's this herb and here's this diet and that didn't work. Let's change it. And working through a changing process. And that's how somebody sees help, not just, oh, you have high blood pressure chronically. Like, you just take this pill and you won't have high blood pressure chronically anymore. It's
Yeah,
like, but why do they have
exactly.
high blood pressure though? Like, it's not
Exactly.
just for no reason.
Yeah, and I think that's like the key piece is like we're treating the why, right? Like, we're ideally, not always, like sometimes we're just managing symptoms, but ideally we're like working on getting to the why of that problem.
So hard to treat the why, because to treat it, you have to know the why, and the why is incredibly a rabbit hole.
It is. It can be very elusive, for sure.
Well, Dr. Josh Korn, we have an excellent conversation. I think this is a good place to leave it off. Thank you so much for being on the show. Always love talking with you, and I'd love to do this again because this is fun.
Always.
How can people find you?
So drjoshkorn.com is my website. If you are in Oregon, I work at Northwest Integrative Medicine. If you are in Texas and want to chat with me, my website is austin.wshcare.org. You can follow me on Instagram at dr.joshkorn.
Excellent. Well, it was a complete pleasure speaking with you. And you can follow me on Instagram at drdan_medicine man. It's like that space thing that it puts like a line under. I don't know what that's called.
That's understand.
Perfect. Yeah, well, that was the Herbal Hour, and that was the conversation.
Cool. Thanks.